The palace glittered beneath thousands of candles, each crystal chandelier scattering warm light across polished marble floors, as though the stars themselves had descended to witness England's grandest gathering. Velvet banners bearing the royal crest hung between towering columns. Musicians filled the ballroom with graceful waltzes, and every noble family of consequence had come dressed in silk, satin, and jewels. Yet beneath the elegance drifted something far less beautiful. Every smile concealed ambition. Every compliment disguised calculation. The kingdom believed the evenings celebrated another season of courtly festivities, but whispers passing from fan to fan carried only one subject. The aging king had finally begun seeking a bride for his only son, the future sovereign of the realm. Among the distinguished guests stood the prince himself, 32 years of age, admired across Britain for his composure, intelligence, and unwavering devotion to duty. Women praised his appearance before ever exchanging a word with him, while statesmen admired his judgment and soldiers trusted his courage. Yet the admiration surrounding him resembled applause heard from behind a closed door, loud enough to recognize, distant enough never to be felt. Years of ceremonial banquets, diplomatic receptions, and carefully arranged introductions had taught him that many who bowed before him admired not the man, but the crown waiting upon his brow. His father observed the endless procession with quiet concern. One by one, dukes, earls, and wealthy industrialists presented their daughters with rehearsed elegance. Young ladies laughed at jokes they scarcely heard, admired paintings they scarcely noticed, and praised the prince's virtues before learning anything of his character. Every conversation seemed polished until it reflected nothing genuine. The prince answered each greeting with flawless courtesy, though inside he felt an exhaustion no physician could cure. As another dance concluded, he withdrew unnoticed toward a gallery overlooking the ballroom. Below him, noble women gathered in small circles beneath blooming arrangements of winter roses, believing themselves beyond the reach of royal ears. Their voices floated upward with startling clarity. "I should not mind if His Royal Highness proved unbearably dull," one young lady remarked with a playful smile. "A crown compensates for many disappointments." Another laughed softly behind an embroidered fan. "One does not marry the gentleman. One marries the kingdom." The women shared restrained laughter, careful enough to preserve appearances, careless enough to reveal their hearts. The prince remained perfectly still. Their words were not cruel in volume, only in honesty. For several long moments, he watched dancers turning beneath golden light, while something fragile within him quietly surrendered. Since childhood, he had been instructed to rule wisely, speak carefully, and place duty before desire. Yet no tutor had ever explained how a man might discover whether he himself was worthy of affection when every introduction began with his title. Late that evening, after the final guests had departed and silence reclaimed the palace corridors, the prince sought the counsel of the only man who had known him before ceremony shaped every hour of his life. Lord Ashcombe, now an elderly royal tutor with silver hair and gentle eyes, listened without interruption as the prince confessed the loneliness hidden beneath years of discipline. "I spent my life surrounded," the prince said quietly, standing beside the library fire. "Yet I cannot remember the last conversation in which I believed someone was speaking to me rather than to the throne I shall inherit." The old tutor folded his hands thoughtfully. "And what would your highness seek if rank were stripped away?" The prince stared into the flames. "One honest opinion." The following morning, with the king's reluctant blessing and the chief steward's careful assistance, an extraordinary secret was born within the palace walls. The prince exchanged tailored coats embroidered with gold for the simple black uniform of an ordinary palace waiter. His polished boots gave way to worn leather shoes. Even his hair was trimmed into a modest style common among household servants. He adopted a common name and accepted the duties expected of any young attendant carrying trays through the endless halls of the royal residence. Only 3 souls knew the truth: the king, Lord Ashcombe, and the chief steward who supervised the household staff. The prince soon discovered a world invisible from the throne. Servants greeted one another with sincere warmth despite modest wages. Kitchen maids laughed while kneading bread before dawn. Stable boys worked through freezing mornings without complaint. Their conversations lacked refinement, but they possessed something infinitely rarer than polished etiquette: honesty. Several days into his disguise, while delivering refreshments to a reception held for visiting aristocrats, he encountered another lesson altogether. A richly dressed young countess extended her glass toward him without meeting his eyes. As he stepped forward, she deliberately loosened her grip. Deep crimson wine cascaded across his plain waistcoat. The surrounding ladies gasped only briefly before amused smiles spread among them. "Oh dear," one murmured. "It appears the poor fellow cannot even carry a tray properly." Another added with a careless shrug, "Servants ought to remember their place and keep their eyes lowered." Gentle laughter rippled through the gathering. The prince bowed his head, resisting every instinct that urged him to answer. Then another voice entered the silence. "Perhaps," it said calmly, "those who possess the least power deserve the greatest courtesy." He looked up. Standing near an archway was a young woman unlike the jeweled ladies surrounding her. She wore a neatly mended blue dress, whose careful stitching revealed both poverty and pride. Her gloves had been repaired more than once, and no diamonds sparkled at her throat. Yet her posture possessed quiet dignity, and intelligence shone within kind gray eyes. She stepped forward carrying a clean linen cloth. "I am sorry for what has happened," she said, offering the cloth without hesitation. No gentleman's worth is measured by the coat upon his shoulders. The ballroom seemed strangely distant. No one had defended him because they believed him important. She defended him because she believed him human. He accepted the cloth, meeting her gaze for only a heartbeat before she excused herself and disappeared toward the palace archives, leaving behind neither flirtation nor expectation. For the first time in many years, the future king found himself eager not for another royal ceremony, but for the chance to learn the name of the woman who had shown kindness to a man she believed was nothing more than a poor waiter. The following days unfolded with a quiet rhythm the prince had never before experienced. Instead of waking to chamberlains announcing meetings and ministers awaiting audiences, he reported before sunrise to the palace kitchens, where copper pots gleamed in the firelight and the scent of freshly baked bread drifted through ancient stone corridors. Every task demanded humility rather than authority. He polished silver, carried breakfast trays, arranged crystal glasses, and listened to conversations no royal proclamation could ever reach. Behind the grandeur of the palace existed another kingdom, sustained not by crowns, but by countless unseen hands. Yet amidst these ordinary duties, his thoughts returned again and again to the young woman whose simple act of kindness had unsettled everything he believed about the people surrounding him. He soon learned that her name was Miss Eleanor Ashford. She was 25 years of age and the daughter of the palace's late chief librarian, a scholar who had devoted nearly 4 decades to preserving the kingdom's historical manuscripts before illness claimed his life. Following her father's passing, Eleanor had accepted temporary employment within the palace archives, repairing fragile volumes, cataloging letters, and protecting centuries of history from decay. The position paid modestly, yet she carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who measured wealth not in coins, but in purpose. Their paths crossed naturally within the vast corridors. Sometimes he delivered correspondence to the archives. At other times, she visited the kitchens to borrow sealing wax or request fresh candles for late-night work. Their conversations began with nothing more than polite greetings, but each encounter lingered a little longer than the last. One bitter evening, frost covered the palace windows like delicate lace, and most of the household had retired. As the prince carried a tray of tea through a deserted hallway, he noticed a warm glow beneath the archive door. Curious, he knocked gently. "Enter," Eleanor called. She sat surrounded by towering shelves filled with leather-bound books, carefully restoring the cracked spine of a manuscript older than the kingdom's current dynasty. Candlelight danced across her concentrated expression. "I noticed your lamp still burning," he said. "I thought you might welcome some tea." She smiled with genuine surprise. "That is remarkably thoughtful. Most people forget this room exists after sunset." He placed the tray upon her desk. My mother often said that forgotten rooms deserve remembered kindness. She studied him for a brief moment. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was. For several peaceful minutes, they spoke while snow gathered silently beyond the windows. They discussed ancient chronicles, forgotten monarchs, and the curious way history often celebrated victories, while overlooking quiet acts of compassion. Eleanor gently closed the manuscript before her. I sometimes believe the truest history is never written, she said softly. He looked up. What do you mean? The greatest kindnesses leave no monuments. The bravest sacrifices rarely receive portraits, yet they shape lives more deeply than battles. Her words settled within him with unexpected force. Having grown up surrounded by statues honoring kings and generals, he had never considered that history's most meaningful moments might pass unseen. Their meetings became an unspoken habit. Whenever his duties allowed, he found reasons to pass through the archive. Sometimes he carried fresh candles. Sometimes he delivered correspondence that another servant could easily have brought. Occasionally, they simply shared a few quiet minutes beside the fire before returning to their work. One afternoon, while arranging books upon a high shelf, Eleanor reached upward, revealing the worn stitching along her gloves. The leather had been repaired several times, each careful seam speaking of thrift rather than neglect. She quickly lowered her hands, perhaps hoping he had not noticed. He said nothing. The image remained with him throughout the evening. The following morning before dawn, he quietly placed a neatly wrapped parcel outside the archive door. Inside rested a beautifully crafted pair of warm gloves made from soft brown leather, elegant enough to last many winters, yet simple enough not to attract attention. No note accompanied the gift. Later that day, he watched discreetly from a distant corridor as Eleanor discovered the package. She examined the gloves with visible admiration before her expression changed. Instead of slipping them on, she carried the parcel from room to room, asking whether anyone had misplaced it. She questioned servants, clerks, and even the chief steward, insisting such generosity must surely belong to someone else. Only after every inquiry failed did she reluctantly return the parcel to her desk. That evening he encountered her once more. I hope whoever lost those gloves is found, she remarked. He feigned ignorance. Were they valuable? Very. Then why not simply keep them? She smiled gently. Because gratitude is not permission. If they belong to another, they are not mine to claim. The prince lowered his eyes for a moment, humbled by a lesson no royal tutor had ever taught him. Elsewhere within the palace, an entirely different contest unfolded. The noble ladies invited to future receptions had begun competing with increasing desperation. Lavish gowns appeared more extravagant each week. Rare jewels adorned graceful necks. Elaborate charitable gestures were performed whenever members of the royal household were nearby, only to vanish once attention wandered elsewhere. Hidden beneath his servant's uniform, the prince witnessed conversations never intended for princely ears. One young marchioness dismissed an elderly maid with unnecessary sharpness before immediately transforming her expression as a royal secretary entered the room. Another declared she adored orphan children, only to complain moments later that charity consumed too much valuable time. Their elegance remained flawless. Their sincerity did not. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued living quietly beyond such performances. She greeted gardeners with the same respect she offered visiting scholars. She thanked kitchen boys for carrying heavy books. She spoke every person's name instead of addressing them merely by occupation. One rainy afternoon, while delivering documents to the village church on behalf of the archives, the prince happened to notice Eleanor taking an unfamiliar path after finishing her own errands. Keeping a respectful distance, he watched her stop before a modest cottage at the edge of the estate. An elderly widow opened the door. Eleanor embraced the woman warmly before placing several small coins into her hands along with a parcel of bread and medicine. "There is no need to repay me," Eleanor said kindly. "My father often reminded me that kindness borrowed from another should be passed onward, never returned." She departed without waiting for thanks. The prince later learned the widow had once cared for Eleanor's father during his final illness. Though Eleanor's wages barely supported herself, she quietly shared what little she possessed every month. She had spoken of it to no one. As he walked back toward the palace beneath the fading afternoon sky, the weight of his disguise grew heavier than before. What had begun as an experiment to uncover false affection was becoming something far more dangerous. For the first time in his life, he feared he was no longer pretending merely to be a servant. He was becoming a man who dreaded the day the woman he admired would discover he had never truly been one at all. By the arrival of early spring, the palace gardens had awakened beneath pale sunlight, and blossoms climbed the old stone walls with quiet determination. The air carried the fragrance of lilacs and freshly turned earth, yet the beauty surrounding the palace brought the prince little peace. Each passing day strengthened the affection growing within his heart, while the secret he carried became increasingly difficult to defend. He had begun this unusual journey believing truth could be discovered through disguise. Now he feared the disguise itself had become the greatest falsehood of all. Whenever he looked upon Eleanor, he wondered how many honest conversations would disappear the moment she learned his real name. She, meanwhile, remained wonderfully unchanged. Her kindness never grew warmer because she believed him useful, nor colder because he possessed no influence. She greeted him with the same gentle smile, whether he carried polished silver or dusty ledgers. To her, dignity belonged equally to every soul who walked the palace corridors. One afternoon, while arranging books in the archives, she paused beside a window overlooking the royal gardens. "It is remarkable," she said thoughtfully, "how flowers bloom without asking who will admire them." The prince smiled faintly. Perhaps people should learn from flowers. She laughed softly. That would spare the world a great many disappointments. Their friendship had become the most treasured part of his hidden life. They often shared brief conversations during quiet hours, discussing literature, faith, duty, and the peculiar burdens carried by those expected to meet the hopes of others. Unlike the nobles who sought polished answers, Eleanor welcomed thoughtful silence. She never hurried conversations toward conclusions, allowing ideas to unfold naturally. One evening, dark clouds gathered unexpectedly over the palace. Before long, heavy rain drummed against the windows, and servants hurried through the halls, securing shutters against the wind. The prince had been delivering correspondence when the storm forced him to seek shelter inside the vast glass conservatory adjoining the palace gardens. To his surprise, Eleanor was already there. She stood among blooming orchids and climbing roses, watching rain cascade across the towering glass ceiling. The storm transformed the conservatory into a world apart from the palace, where candlelight shimmered against wet leaves and thunder echoed like distant drums across the countryside. "It seems," she said with a warm smile, "that the weather has decided neither of us shall continue our duties." He set his satchel upon a nearby bench. "Then perhaps it has offered us a brief holiday." For several quiet moments, they simply listened to the rain. The prince finally broke the silence. "May I ask you something rather unusual?" "You may. If a man were born into great responsibility, so great that everyone admired the position, but seldom understood the person, do you believe he could ever live freely?" She considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe responsibility itself is not the prison." He looked toward her. "What is then?" She gently touched one of the white blossoms beside her. "The prison is believing one must hide one's true heart in order to carry responsibility." Those words struck him with astonishing force. He wondered whether she somehow sensed the truth concealed behind his plain uniform. He forced himself to remain calm, and if he feared revealing himself would cost him the only genuine friendship he has ever known. She turned fully toward him, her expression softened by compassion rather than curiosity. "Then he has discovered something precious enough to fear losing." The prince lowered his gaze. Every instinct urged him to confess everything. Instead, he whispered, "You speak as though you understand loneliness." A faint sadness crossed Eleanor's face. "When my father died," she answered quietly, "many people expressed sympathy because they respected his position. Very few remained after the funeral to ask whether I was managing alone." She smiled gently despite the memory. That is when one learns the difference between attention and affection. The conservatory fell silent once more. Rain continued striking the glass overhead while the prince realized he had never heard words that described his own life so perfectly. Gathering his courage, he asked another question. "Have you never wished to marry?" She laughed softly. "I have wished to love. There is a difference. A very great one." She looked beyond the rain toward the fading evening sky. "I have seen too many ladies measure gentlemen by estates, titles, or fortunes. I would rather remain unmarried than become someone's ornament." Her voice remained calm, yet every word carried quiet conviction. "I hope," she continued, "to someday meet a man whose greatest pride is not what the world calls him, but how he treats those who can offer him nothing." The prince felt his heart tighten. Without realizing it, she had described precisely the test he himself had been conducting. He stepped closer, scarcely aware of the distance between them. "You have restored something I believed forever lost." She met his eyes. What was that? Hope. Neither spoke again. The silence between them contained more honesty than countless conversations held beneath chandeliers and royal banners. Yet while affection quietly blossomed within the conservatory, envy was taking root elsewhere in the palace. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe, the ambitious daughter of a powerful duke, had grown increasingly suspicious. She had noticed the mysterious friendship developing between the humble waiter and the librarian's daughter. At first she dismissed it as harmless. Soon, however, she began viewing Eleanor's calm happiness as an insult to her own carefully planned pursuit of the future king. One morning she deliberately followed Eleanor through several palace corridors before confronting her outside the archives. "So," Lady Beatrice announced loudly enough for nearby servants and guests to hear, "our scholarly little librarian has found amusement among the servants." Several aristocratic ladies stopped to watch. Eleanor remained perfectly composed. "I do not understand your meaning, my lady." "Oh, I think you understand very well. It is rather bold for a woman employed by the palace to spend so much time entertaining a waiter." The surrounding whispers spread immediately. Some smiled with amusement. Others simply watched. The prince approached from the far end of the corridor carrying a tray, arriving just in time to hear every word. Lady Beatrice continued mercilessly. "Perhaps poverty encourages ambition. Some women aim higher than their station by beginning with the household staff." Quiet laughter followed. The prince's hands tightened around the silver tray. Every instinct demanded that he reveal himself and silence the insult forever. Before he could move, Eleanor answered with remarkable calm. "I cannot prevent others from inventing stories." She lifted her chin with quiet dignity. But truth does not become weaker because falsehood is spoken loudly. Her composure only deepened Lady Beatrice's anger. Within hours, malicious gossip spread through the palace. By evening, Eleanor was informed that, until the rumors subsided, her temporary duties in the archives would be suspended to avoid further scandal. She accepted the decision without protest. The following morning, carrying only a small suitcase containing her father's books and a few simple belongings, she quietly walked toward the palace gates. Hidden beneath the archway, the prince watched in helpless silence. His disguise had protected his secret, but it had failed to protect the one person whose kindness had changed his life. As Eleanor disappeared beyond the palace walls without once looking back, the prince understood that waiting any longer would cost far more than his carefully guarded identity. The palace awoke to uneasy silence. Servants moved through its corridors with lowered voices, while members of the aristocracy spoke in careful whispers, uncertain why an extraordinary royal assembly had been summoned with only a day's notice. Invitations bearing the king's seal had reached every distinguished household before sunrise, commanding their immediate attendance. Rumor traveled faster than certainty. Some believed the prince had finally chosen his bride. Others suspected a matter of state. None imagined that the greatest revelation would concern not a kingdom's future, but the hidden character of those who hoped to rule beside its future king. Within his private chambers, the prince stood once more before the mirror, where his remarkable journey had begun. Upon the table rested the plain black waistcoat he had worn as a waiter, neatly folded beside the ceremonial uniform of the heir to the throne. For several moments he looked between the two garments without moving. One represented the life into which he had been born. The other had introduced him to the life he had never truly known. Lord Ashcombe entered quietly. "The carriage has been prepared, Your Highness." The prince nodded, but did not turn away from the mirror. "I believed I was searching for a wife," he said softly. "Instead, I discovered the kind of man I wished I had become years ago." The elderly tutor smiled with quiet pride. "Then perhaps this disguise has accomplished more than any crown ever could." Slowly, the prince removed the servant's clothing for the final time and dressed once again in the deep blue uniform embroidered with silver thread reserved for the heir apparent. As each medal and sash returned to their familiar place, he felt not triumph, but responsibility. The truth he was about to reveal would not merely expose deception. It would judge every heart that had crossed his path during those unforgettable weeks. Meanwhile, miles beyond the palace gates, Eleanor sat inside the modest cottage she had rented after leaving the royal estate. Her belongings occupied only a handful of shelves. Her father's treasured books lined one wall, and fresh flowers rested beside his framed portrait. Though saddened by the manner of her departure, she harbored no bitterness. She believed reputation could be wounded by gossip, but character remained untouched by it. A firm knock interrupted her thoughts. Outside stood a royal messenger. He bowed respectfully before presenting a sealed envelope. "Miss Eleanor Ashford, by command of His Majesty the King, your presence is requested at the palace immediately." She stared at the royal seal in astonishment. "I fear there has been some mistake." "There is none, miss." She hesitated only briefly before preparing for the journey. She chose not an extravagant gown, for she owned none, but the same carefully mended blue dress she had worn on the day she first defended a humble waiter. If she were to stand once more inside the palace, she wished to do so exactly as herself, owing nothing to appearances. By afternoon, the grand ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers once again. Nobles filled the vast chamber in magnificent attire, their conversations hushed by anticipation. Lady Beatrice stood confidently among them, convinced that the royal announcement would restore the attention she believed was rightfully hers. Around her gathered families, whose ambitions glittered as brightly as their jewels. At the rear of the hall, Eleanor entered quietly. Several ladies recognized her immediately, exchanging surprised glances. A few whispered behind embroidered fans, questioning why a dismissed archivist had been invited to such an occasion. Eleanor ignored every stare and took her place near the marble columns, hoping only to leave once the mysterious summons had been explained. Trumpets echoed through the ballroom. Every conversation ceased. The great doors opened. The king entered first, leaning lightly upon his carved ebony cane, followed by ministers, military officers, and members of the royal household. Yet murmurs spread almost instantly, for one familiar figure seemed strangely absent. Where was the future king? Before anyone could ask, another set of footsteps echoed across the polished floor. A young man walked confidently into the ballroom, wearing the simple black uniform of a palace waiter. Laughter broke the silence. Several nobles exchanged bewildered smiles. Lady Beatrice looked almost offended. "Has the household entirely forgotten today's importance?" she muttered. The waiter continued walking until he reached the center of the ballroom. Then he stopped. The king slowly rose from his throne. His voice carried effortlessly through the chamber. "My lords and ladies, during these past weeks, many among you believed you were observed only by one another." The ballroom became perfectly still. "You were mistaken." He turned toward the young waiter. "I present before you not a servant of this household, but my son, the Prince of Wales, and the future king of this kingdom." A collective gasp swept through the hall. Faces drained of color. Fans slipped from trembling hands. Several gentlemen instinctively lowered their heads. Lady Beatrice staggered backward, unable to speak. Before them all, the prince calmly removed the servant's coat, revealing beneath it the royal uniform he had worn concealed from view. The transformation lasted only moments, yet it shattered every assumption upon which the gathering had been built. He allowed the silence to settle before speaking. I wished to know whether my future queen would recognize dignity when stripped of privilege. His voice remained calm, neither bitter nor triumphant. I discovered much more. His eyes moved slowly across the assembled nobility. I witnessed kindness performed only when watched, charity offered for applause, courtesy reserved for titles. I heard honest labor mocked and humble people dismissed, as though birth alone determined worth. No one interrupted. No one dared. He continued. I also witnessed a kitchen maid sharing bread with a stable boy who had forgotten his meal. I saw elderly servants comfort one another without expecting recognition. And I met a woman who defended a stranger simply because she believed cruelty was beneath any decent person. His gaze found Eleanor standing quietly at the back of the hall. She looked at him in complete disbelief. Tears gathered before she could speak. The prince descended from the platform and crossed the ballroom, every step echoing through the vast chamber. When he finally stood before her, the room seemed to disappear. "Eleanor," he said gently, "when I wore a crown, every smile belonged to the throne. When I carried a tray, only one heart chose kindness before knowing my name." He paused, emotion softening his usually composed voice. "You reminded me that a kingdom cannot be governed by ceremony alone. It must be governed by compassion." Taking her trembling hand, he continued, "I cannot erase the pain my silence caused you, and I shall regret that for the rest of my life. But before this court, before my father, and before the God who judges every crown, I ask not for your forgiveness alone." He lowered himself onto one knee. "I ask whether you would honor me by becoming not merely my wife, but the queen who will remind this nation that character is the highest form of nobility." A stunned silence filled the ballroom. Many nobles, who had spent months pursuing a crown, now found themselves witnesses to something infinitely greater than royal ceremony. Eleanor looked down at the man she had believed to be an ordinary waiter, remembering every quiet conversation, every shared cup of tea, every gentle act performed without expectation of reward. At last she smiled through her tears. "I never offered kindness because I imagined greatness hiding beneath humble clothes," she whispered. "I offered it because every soul deserves it." She gently helped him to his feet. "And if the man I came to admire beneath that simple uniform is the same man standing before me now, then my answer is yes." Warm applause began among the palace, servants lining the walls. One by one, even the nobles joined them, many lowering their heads in genuine shame rather than wounded pride. Lady Beatrice quietly slipped from the ballroom, realizing that wealth, beauty, and ambition had all failed where simple goodness had quietly prevailed. Several months later, the kingdom celebrated a wedding unlike any remembered in generations. The streets overflowed not merely because a future king had married, but because people believed they had witnessed hope triumph over vanity. During the ceremony, the prince requested that palace servants stand alongside dukes and duchesses as honored guests, declaring that loyalty and integrity deserved places of equal honor. Years afterward, chroniclers would describe the reign that followed as one marked by fairness, humility, and uncommon compassion. Yet those who had been present understood that the true beginning of that remarkable reign had not occurred beneath a crown or during a coronation. It had begun on the day a young woman in a mended blue dress chose to defend a poor waiter whom the rest of the world had refused to see. And from that single act of quiet kindness, a kingdom discovered that the greatest royalty is not inherited by birth, but earned through the nobility of one's heart.